baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
What? Everybody doesn't think the legislative branch is sexy?
For some reason they don't. I don't understand that. So what we miss about Congress is all those things that we don't see in the day-to-day coverage, which is that it's more bipartisan than people think it is. Most things pass with overwhelming bipartisan support. It's more productive than people think it is because so much gets passed in those moments of passage. Those laws tend to be really large and do many, many things. And they also tend to miss that members of Congress are working much harder to be responsive to their voters than we think. I think that there's more turnover in Congress than I think we give it credit for.
It is a perfect podcast, though. And now, here are James and Emily. Good morning, Dr. Stacy.
Good morning, James. How are you?
I am fantastic. It feels like it has been forever since we've both been in this studio at the same time.
It truly has been.
And I am excited that we're back and we're kicking off this year. So much is happening, and I have so many thoughts, but we don't have time for that today because we have a great guest that you contacted and invited to come on. And so I'm excited. Why don't you introduce who we have? So
James Curry is a professor of political science at Notre Dame, which is pretty obviously impressive on its own. His research centers on U.S. politics and policymaking with a focus on the U.S. Congress, which is something that you and I and at the national level, obviously very interested in, but down to the granular level, we live it day to day. He is the author of 3 books, which are incredibly interesting: Legislating in the Dark, 2015, The Limits of Party, 2020, with Francis Lee. And I'm missing one. What's the other one, James Curry? Which one am I missing?
Understanding American Legislators.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's the great one. Yeah, that's the one that gets down to the granular. His research has been published in the American Political Science Review, incredibly impressive, Journal of Politics, Perspectives on Politics, etc. You are a pretty important political scientist, American political scientist at the moment. Provided testimony to the U.S. House, received your PhD in government from the University of Maryland. You've worked on Capitol Hill, so you have that gritty experience like I have, only at the Oklahoma level, right? Where you have it in the really lovely parts of the sausage making factory. So we're really excited to have you on our little podcast today. And we like to start Not My Generation because, of course, it's geared towards talking about generational politics. I didn't act whenever I asked you. So I guess, I should also mention that you're my regional chapter director, coordinator, what's your title? What are you to me?
Yes, I'm like I'm your chaptery advisory council member.
Yes, you're my guru. Let's say you're my regional guru for the Scholar Strategy Network, a little national organization that Theta Scotchpol was actually instrumental in starting, that pulls together different stakeholders, but specifically brings academics into the conversation with the media and brings our expertise into the spotlight. And so James is part of that network and has been part of the leadership for a while, and so is my guy. In terms of our proximity geography in the middle of, flyover country, if you will. So I didn't explain to you that, again, not my generation. There's a reason why we call it that. I am a disgruntled millennial, elder millennial. We don't like the term. We don't like the term geriatric. Thank you. And I come from a more liberal, progressive side of politics. And James is a very fish shaking at the sky Gen Xer who comes from the libertarian perspective. So we kind of parse things in that direction. So that explains our icebreaker questions.
Got it.
At least the first one. So
and horseshoe theory really comes into play in this podcast.
It does, very much so.
I'm just going to say, yeah.
we fight a lot less than people think we would.
That's good.
Well, let's jump into the icebreaker.
You go
questions.
first. I've been talking too much.
So, where do you fit? Are you Gen X, millennial? You're certainly not a boomer, but so where do you fall into that generational framing?
I am technically an elder millennial as well, though I like to think about myself as a cusper. If you've heard that term of being like right on the cusp of where Gen X becomes millennial, in part because my sister and I are only a couple years apart, but she would technically be on one side of that divide and I would technically be on the other. But we were raised in the same household the same way. So I think we view ourselves as somewhat stuck in between the two generations.
Very interesting. So what are you, like 82, 81?
Yeah, early 80s, I'm in my 40s, that whole deal.
I love that. Look and listen to you. So mysterious. All right, sir. Like James Curry's not going to let me pin down his age. I love this. Oh, very, very demure, very polite. I love it.
That's awesome.
That is hysterical. So what are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
So I guess I was thinking about this one when you asked. I've been watching, something I wanted to point out, I'm watching The Crown, which is that
nice
drama on Netflix about the British royal family. I don't know why I'm watching it, but it's interesting. I guess I always find anything that has to do with politics interesting. And so this was one that grabbed my attention. It's pretty good.
Very good. Cool. Yeah, we all need brain candy, man. Don't judge yourself too harshly.
What is your favorite social media platform?
So I try to stay as far away from social media as possible as a general rule.
We get that a lot.
I'm not really on Twitter or X. I have an old Facebook account that I never look at. I do have an Instagram account that I use exclusively for looking at essentially jokes about sports and cats. But that's about it. Otherwise, I find I'm a lot happier if I stay away from social.
Right.
I was going to say, your mental health is probably really good if you're staying off social.
It's better than it would be.
Just your overall personality and outlook. I find anymore, doesn't matter which platform I happen to be on, everybody's angry. Everybody thinks everybody else is out to get them. It's really not a healthy space most of the time.
Or some of us just consume news and spiral. That's what I mean.
Yeah, that is.
That's what I would do, which is why I have to stay off of it, because otherwise I don't know that I would do anything else.
Yeah, It's a choice. I've got a great therapist, James Curry. Don't worry about me.
Good.
Don't worry. Favorite pastime or hobby?
Since you used the word pastime, my favorite pastime is baseball. I love baseball. I played baseball growing up. I watch as much as I can. My son plays baseball now. I used to coach his team. Now he's older and beyond my abilities to teach him anything. But love baseball.
Very good. All right, last one, James Davenport.
Yes. All right. So what is one event that has occurred in your lifetime that has the most impact on your political views or beliefs?
This was a tough one. I thought about it for a while, and I think the correct answer is probably the Iraq War controversy about whether or not to go into Iraq back in 2002, 2003. I was in college. This sort of really captivated my attention and my engagement in politics. I think I was always somewhat interested in politics, but this kind of pushed me, I think, over the top. And it's still something I think about a lot. So I think that's it. I think that would have to be it.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, I agree. So I will be less demure than James Curry. I just turned 41 over the Christmas break. And so, I mean, I have, visceral memories of, riding with my grandmother as a sophomore into AP government on the day that, the towers fell on 9/11 and, going into, 2003, I was a freshman in college in August. And I mean, it was the perfect, I mean, it was ripe, man, for us to become just nerdy as all hell. I love it. I love political science. It's wonderful.
It is.
It's so wonderful.
It is.
Such a nerd.
That's right.
All right, James Curry. So let's talk about your books. So first question sort of, amalgamates, right? We wanted to sort of go through everything, but I don't think, obviously, we're going to ask you all 10 of these questions. Hopefully the conversation is more fluid, and obviously we will edit as we go along. This does not have to be a perfect podcast, and if you want to, or a perfect recording, I should say. So if there are things said that you want to edit out later, just send me an email, things like that, right? We're obviously not live.
It is a perfect podcast, though.
I mean, I meant recording flawless.
Exactly.
Santiago is fabulous, our producer.
He edits out all the bad stuff.
It makes me sound coherent most of the time. So across your 3 published books, you trace a shift from party-centered explanations of Congress to a more institutionally fragmented reality. So how has your understanding of legislative power evolved over the course of your research?
I think that explanation you give kind of describes how my understanding of Congress and legislatures really has evolved over time. I started out really focused on trying to understand power inside Congress. And that, I think because of the time period that I was in graduate school, that quickly became a focus on party power. And because I think at the time, it was like the mid to late 2000s, there was so much of a focus in poli-sci and particularly in legislative studies on questions about parties and party leaders. Did they have power? How much power do they have? Are parties really that meaningful? Or are they just like a group of people who agree with each other? And at the time, I think I saw research that questioned the importance of parties and especially party leaders as sort of absurd. And I think that came from having spent time on Capitol Hill where it was just plainly obvious, even if you couldn't always put your finger on it, it was plainly obvious that party leaders were incredibly powerful and important, that the party was incredibly important to what was going on. So I was really motivated to get engaged with that research space because I thought there was a lot to say. But this really changed as time went on, and probably for a lot of reasons. I came to, over time, better to appreciate the limits of party power on Capitol Hill. And I think I also came to appreciate the fact that parties and leaders can simultaneously be quite powerful and still really fail to produce partisan outcomes most of the time. And so that those two things don't necessarily have to go together. And I think as I gained an appreciation of that, that sort of started shifting my focus, still being about power in Congress. I think still that's what I really am interested in, but it sort of shifted my focus more towards the other things that are important in the legislative process and how they interact with the role of parties and leaders and the institution generally.
How much of that kind of reduction in the power of party and positional power within the party is connected to, say, the more independent nature of campaigning? In other words, I don't see people campaigning strictly as vote for me because I'm Republican. I mean, they have their own campaigns. They don't rely on the party for funding anymore. They don't rely on the party for infrastructure to run their campaigns as much. And so you have people who feels like come into this system more independent from the party to begin with than perhaps what they were a generation or two ago.
Yeah, that's a big thing that limits parties and fractures them, right? Like the members of the party are not brought into the Congress by the people in charge of the party. That's always been true to some degree, but it's probably even more true now because you can raise your money independently. Like you said, you run your campaign by yourself. You're not as beholden to party leaders for much of anything at all. To the degree that you go along with them, it has to do with other forces or a desire to, this teamsmanship desire, or because You may agree with the general principles of what you're trying to accomplish as a party, but you have your own sort of independent base of money, power, voter support, et cetera. And that's a huge limiting force on party leaders in this country. That's a big difference from being sort of essentially thinking about being the prime minister in the UK or being a party leader in a more party-centric system where you have a lot of control over who's in and out of the party, who's in and off the party list. You don't have that here. And so that's really limiting for party leaders' ability to get things done the way that maybe they would like to get things done, to pass policies as they are written in the party's like programmatic agenda platforms, right? They can't do it because they have to negotiate first and foremost with people within their own party who are coming from very different parts of the country and who are going to find points of disagreement, which really, really makes the job difficult. And then what it can allow for a situation where you have very organizationally strong parties, very procedurally strong parties in Congress and indeed in a number of state legislatures, but that is not enough to allow them to sort of dictate policy change, and that fracturing that comes from every member having their own independent base of power and their own separate constituencies really results in this challenge.
If you had to summarize your core argument about how Congress actually works today, rather than how we often talk about how it works, what would that be? What's the difference there?
So it's a wide gap, right? There's a wide gap, in my opinion, between how we talk about Congress and how Congress actually is. The general narrative of Congress is this. It's that Congress doesn't do much at all, that mostly people there just fight with each other, and that the only things that happen are very partisan things that happen on a party line. And I think that we think this way because that is generally what we are confronted with when we look at Congress from the outside. We see fighting all the time, especially partisan fighting, because that's what the news media focuses in on, but also because that's what Congress and especially the parties in Congress use the visible and visual aspects of congressional action to actually emphasize. Disagreement and the drawing of distinctions between the two sides. That's what they try to create because it's good for electioneering, it's good for the election, and so there's a lot of manufactured conflict. We also see in action because Congress is a deliberative legislature. It's going to, by nature, spend more time not passing a law than it is passing a law. That is, if Congress spends 30 days working on the law, writing it, wrangling over it, debating it, and so on, 29 of those days are going to be the fight, the debate, the deliberations, everything else. And just one day, the last day, is going to be the action. Francis Lee, Rob Oldham, and I found that this has a profound impact on how Congress is covered. We did this in a recent paper. We looked at news media coverage of COVID relief legislation that should actually represent everything people supposedly want Congress to be, right? It acted energetically, expediently, and in a bipartisan fashion to pass major legislation to address a crisis. In fact, between February and December of 2020, it passed 5 major COVID relief bills accounting for trillions of dollars in government relief to fight the virus, support the economy, and provide direct relief to millions of Americans. If media coverage of Congress was ever going to be positive and focus on action rather than conflict, it was then. But that's not what happened. We found that media coverage of congressional action on those bills was just as overwhelmingly focused on conflict, partisan disagreement, and inaction. And that's because even when Congress is acting quickly, it still spends more days debating, deliberating, and fighting than it does actually passing things, right? So what we miss about Congress is all those things that we don't see in the day-to-day coverage, which is that it's more bipartisan than people think it is. Most things pass with overwhelming bipartisan support. It's more productive than people think it is because so much gets passed in those moments of passage. Those laws tend to be really large and do many, many things. And they also tend to miss that members of Congress are working much harder to be responsive to their voters than we think. And that last bit's maybe a bit different, but we can get into it if you like.
No, I think that point is one that a lot of people I know, students or just people that I engage with, it's like, oh, they don't pay attention to us. They don't care what we think. And it's like, no, it's exactly the opposite. Because that's their interest. It is in their interest to know what their voters, their constituents want if they want to keep going back there. And I have found that, Now, who they pay attention to, we can discuss that, right? Do they pay attention to just voters? Do they pay attention just the voters that are from their party that are going to elect them? But they are connected in some meaningful way to the people within their districts, much more so than I think the general public, the media, and sometimes even us academics give them credit for.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think if you spend time with legislators, whether it's at a national level or a state level, you find just how obsessed they are with trying to understand what it is that voters in their district or state want, and then what that means for how they should act in terms of how they should vote on this bill, or what legislation they should work on, or what they should talk about in the media or on social media. That's an obsession for them all the time, which keeps them closer or more connected in and more tapped in and working harder on behalf of the people that they think they have to work hard to keep the support of.
I'm wondering just how much harder it is to do that today. Even with gerrymandering, and we're packing Republicans into Republican districts and Democrats into Democrat districts. But again, that assumes that all Republicans and all Democrats think exactly alike. And I'm just as the United States has become more diverse in every possible way, how much more difficult is it for a representative or a senator to be able to understand what it is and to what extent any given policy or issue carries a majority that they can identify behind it?
I think it's extremely hard, and for a lot of reasons. I think one reason is that it's hard, and maybe harder than ever before, is that districts are so much bigger. This number of people in a congressional district increases constantly because we haven't increased the size of the House of Representatives for over 100 years. States keep getting bigger too, which means that senators are representing more people. It's a lot harder to get a sense of what it is that your voters want when there's more and more and more of them. You couldn't possibly connect with them all. And then, gerrymandering may simplify the partisan dimensions of this, but then the districts that get gerrymandered to produce a sort of partisan outcome also don't make any sense from a community standpoint. And so it's really hard for members to wrap their head around, what is this district and who are the people in it? And they work really hard to try to figure that out. They create their own sort of mental perceptions of it, but they're always at a loss. And then you add to that, there's probably more noise today than ever before, right? You have constant noise coming back at you from the district, from voters, from people, from interests. People are very engaged at a number of levels, which is great, but it means there's so much to wade through as a member of Congress or for someone who works for them to try to figure out, what is it that would make these people happy? And what decision can we make that would make the largest share of them happy? And that's not always clear or obvious in any way, which just makes it quite a difficult task, which doesn't mean that they all do as well as they possibly could all the time at it, or that they're all equally virtuous. But it does mean the task at the outset is something that's very hard to do.
And that's a perfect segue into the next question, sort of the idea of how do we know and I can identify what the voters want in any given district, especially via diversity within a district, and the voids of knowledge that legislators themselves have, right? These are human beings. I think a lot of Americans forget that whenever we elect Jim Bob from, Woodward, Oklahoma, to go represent us, out of our 5 districts, that he's a veterinarian and he got his degree, and that's a niche part of education, and he may have some tax background and whatever, but he doesn't perhaps know about healthcare for people or the education policies or perhaps foreign policy, etc. So the voids in knowledge that these legislators also take with them to the state level or to the national level. So legislating in the dark then emphasizes how members often are voting without full knowledge of policy consequences. And I kind of also want to add to that is that because they're not actually reading the policies that's a 1A question, if you will. I'm going to throw that in there. But then how widespread is this uncertainty, and how intentional is it?
It's widespread. Sometimes it's partially intentional, it's partially unintentional. Like you said, people go to Congress and they're not policy experts. And they rarely become policy experts. They're generally their job is to be a policy generalist. They have to know a little bit about everything and enough to vote on those things, which means they're not in the weeds. And I think, especially as political scientists, one thing that we forget is that people who run for Congress don't run for Congress or state legislature because they are fascinated with legislatures or necessarily have like a very in-depth academic knowledge of how the government actually works.
What? Not everybody doesn't think the legislative branch is sexy?
For some reason they don't. And I don't understand that, but they don't. And they don't, like if you're a political scientist and you study politics or you're a political science major and you take classes, you learn a lot about how the government actually functions. But that's not most people. And most people, when they run for Congress, they run for the state legislature, they don't do it because they're intrinsically interested in government. They do it because they're pissed off about something. There's something in the world that made them unhappy that they want to see change, whether it's a war or taxes or education policy or whatever. That's why they ran. And so they're really interested in that one thing. They have a lot of deep thoughts about that one thing, but now they get into the role and they have to do all these things. They have to weigh in on all these questions, and they don't have the expertise. And they gain knowledge over time, but they still remain generalists. And so what they have to do when a bill is brought to them, when a decision is brought to them, is they have to rely on experts to tell them what a proposed policy's consequences would be or should be. They have to place a lot of trust in these people. And these people are usually their leaders and the people who work for their leaders in the legislature, or they're people who work in the government as bureaucrats, or they are think tank type experts, all of whom have their own agenda, right? The expert staff on committees work for the committee chair, and the expert staff who work for the party leaders work for the party leadership. The expert staff in the bureaucracy work for that agency. So your typical member most of the time has to try to figure out how much they trust these people, but most of the time they just kind of have to take their word for it if they're generally in alignment with these folks. And so bills are brought to the floor, and members are already at a deficit because they don't necessarily have the expertise to know necessarily exactly what this bill is purporting to do, and they certainly don't know if it'll actually succeed. And then they're usually given very little time to consider that legislation. Leaders strategically will give them less time if they want them to have less time to really think about it, which puts them at a deficit to the leadership, to the people who are advancing the legislation, and makes most of the membership reliant on the people pushing the thing to tell them whether it's good or bad, whether they should vote for it or oppose it. It's essentially too hard for them most of the time to come to an independent determination, especially on something that is large, complex, uncertain, and that is happening very quickly. So leaders can use this, they take advantage of this fact, essentially. They use this to build support for their legislation among their rank and file. So do agencies, so do think tanks. This is the real challenge of being a legislator, and it has real consequences for the ability of our legislators to do what we would want in an ideal world, which is have some really precise knowledge about what this thing is and what its consequences would be and how that relates to the interests of their voters. That's probably just too high of a bar for them to reach most of the time.
I'm going to make Davenport cringe a little bit. I wonder where interest groups come into play in terms of that building uncertainty or driving uncertainty.
Yeah, interest groups play a role in this too, right? They're always trying to help fill that knowledge gap, but in a way that meets their own interests, right? Trade groups are going to come in and tell you why the thing that would give them more benefits is good and why the things that would restrict them or harm them are bad. That's difficult because that as a legislator, as a legislative staffer, that all these people giving you information have an agenda, but you have to listen to somebody, right? Nobody's giving you objective knowledge. Maybe your own staff are, but there's probably not enough of them either. So interest groups definitely can play a role, which is why party leaders often try to bring interest groups and interest group leaders into the fold when they're building legislation and packaging it together and then rolling it out to their members, because they want those influential interests to stand behind whatever proposal you have and say, yes, we endorse this and this is why, because that's a powerful signal to members if they want to try to be in alignment with this group or that group or opposed to this group or that group. It helps them understand where they should be if they're trying to be where they usually are in terms of their position on an issue.
a little bit of my libertarian side's going to.
I told you, I made you cringe a little bit.
In that, maybe not in the direction you think, but what this makes me think is these folks should be really slow to pursue any particular policy really aggressively because of the lack of knowledge. Now, I get that electorally, there are times when if you don't do something, the public will elect somebody who will, sure. Right? And at some point, you got to make a decision, right? But it seems to me that people don't get this. I mean, you know this, Emily knows this. Those of us who have studied Congress or legislators knows this process is already slow and challenging to move anything through. And I really liked your discussion at the beginning when we started talking about the negotiation that has to happen even within the party to get their own folks on board before they move this out. And all of that isn't seen. And then now you overlay this with, and they're all being influenced by people who don't have just, this is the objective kind of truth, if you want to use that word. This is the reality. They all have an agenda as to why they're pursuing this particular policy or that. And it seems to me that a lot of these folks, it should make them a little bit more cautious than what sometimes I see them being. Now, again, the process is tedious. It's long. It takes a hard time. So not a whole lot makes it through to begin with. But that just sticks out to me. And it kind of leads to another question along those lines of, how well can we hold these people accountable if we can't make a direct connection between what they did and specific outcomes? And now I talk about this all the time in my classes, especially relating to economic policies, right? Because, a president comes in, they get Congress to pass a particular measure. 2 months later, the economy seems to improve. Look at what we did. And it's like, it doesn't work that way, right? It takes a while for us to be able to accurately measure the outcomes of any of this stuff. And so how well can we hold them accountable for not knowing the precise outcomes that are going to evolve out of any given particular policy or legislation that they pass?
Yeah. I mean, we still can hold them accountable, right? We can hold them accountable for performance in terms of are things getting better or worse, though it may or may not be their fault. We can hold them accountable for how they vote, even if they didn't really know whether the vote they were taking was the right or wrong one at the time. I see this as mostly for this dimension, I see this as particularly perilous for the legislators themselves, right? Having to make decisions in the dark means that they are really often just making their best guess about whether supporting or opposing something is going to be viewed as more or less favorable in the next election, which is what legislators spend their time doing. They try to figure out if I vote for this, will that make people happier who have to go to the ballot box and vote for me in about 18 months from now? Or if I vote against it, will they be more happy with me 18 months from now? Or will no one remember this moment, right? And so it's very perilous for them. They often don't know, and then leaders will often give them little time to decide at the end of the process. You mentioned the legislating is slow, and it is extremely slow until the very end, and then everything is like a mad dash. Once they finally have, they've finally gotten the policy together, they've gotten enough support behind it to put together an initial coalition. Now they need to get the votes together to pass it. Then they tend to move into warp speed, because once you have the thing together, the faster you can move it forward, usually the more support you can get. But general accountability has never really been a strong suit for our system, right? Our
right.
political system is
right.
It's sort of set up to undermine collective accountability, right? We have a system where power is divided. It's rarely clear who's actually in control or who's to blame when decisions are made, especially when we have divided government, which we usually have. And then in any election, the public only gets to weigh in on part of the government at a time, right? The entire House goes up for re-election every 2 years, but the president only every 4. And you only get a third of the Senate each time. And then even then, the public never is voting on the government as a whole. You're voting on your individual representatives, which means this idea of holding the government collectively writ large accountable is just more or less impossible in our system. You can hold your member accountable, and you certainly can punish them if things don't work out the way you want. But it's, for at that level, that individual level, it really is a guessing game a lot of the time for the legislature.
But how often are we doing that? I mean, with the re-election rates, are egregious, right? 100%, 96% of the time, et cetera, right? These higher than my students' math test scores. Percentage of the time, the American public are going to go into the booth and re-elect the same people to the U.S. House, to the same people to the U.S. Senate, unless they have a really good reason not to, like somebody died, for example, or a scandal happened.
I think I'm actually more optimistic on the voter side of this. I think. Oh,
good. I'm so glad somebody is.
Yeah, I think there's more turnover in Congress than I think we give it credit for. Right now, the majority of the Congress has been elected since 2020. Which is quite a bit of turnover.
That's true. Now that's fair.
You don't get people losing re-election at high rates, but you do get them quitting. And in part they quit because they might lose. Or they move on or something else. So I think we do. I think there's enough evidence that voters do respond to like real world dynamics in terms of, at least when you think about them as a mass, about terms of who wins and who loses and who's put in power and who's taken out of power. And they do seem, even at an individual level, to be more likely to vote for members of Congress that they voted in ways that they liked, and more against members of Congress that voted less in ways that they liked. So I think it's there. I think it's hard to see, in part because members that run tend to win all the time. And we have these examples of members of Congress who are there forever, which don't help. But I think below that surface, I think there is a decent amount of like individual level accountability for individual members of Congress vis-a-vis their own voters. I just don't think it translates very well into a collective accountability.
I wanted to go back and talk about, the legislative process and the impact of the party leadership. I have been reading some folks lately who talked about how over the last decade or two that process has largely been taken out of the hands of committees, when it gets to the end, and all in the hands of kind of the party leadership. So you see less reliance on, say, conference committees, less reliant, on committee chairs to be the folks who are really guiding this process. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? And what kind of impact does that have on the process, if that's true?
Yeah, I think committees maintain more power than we give them credit for these days. And in fact, in part because I think a lot of committee power now takes place behind the scenes. Especially in DC, you see less of like the traditional committee processes of like, here's a bill and now we'll hold hearings on it and now we'll hold days and days of markups and then we'll move on to the next step. And they often don't follow that step-by-step approach anymore. But committees, I think, are still the drivers of policy development. But I think the way you put it is right, that leaders now step in on the back end on major legislation and they run the show once it gets to that level, which I think is actually most of the time necessary. I think the political dynamics, the political environment in Washington has become fraught enough where you need sort of an iron fist at the end of the process to get things done. I think your traditional, what we would refer to as regular order legislative processes, like for all their virtue, also create more opportunities for people who are not trying to legislate in good faith, but are just trying to score political points or come up the works. It gives them lots of opportunities to do so. And so handing things off to the leadership and letting them use the procedural powers they have to push things across the finish line, I think is often necessary when you get to that end of the process. And that's not ideal in a lot of ways, but I also think there's a lot of things that would probably have fallen apart that did become law if you tried to finish the process in the sort of like open, deliberative, or like openly deliberative manner that we used to see a generation or so ago. And so it's like, it's good and bad. Like this is it's how I ended when I wrote Legislating the Dark. It's kind of how I ended the book of like, this is good and bad.
It's depressing.
Leaders are really good at getting things across the finish line, and a lot of those things are good policies, but it also does undermine the ability of every member to have sort of like an equivalent level of influence over the final product. But I do think committees are still the drivers of development, and that's probably good because that's where the expertise lies.
Interesting. So again, institutions, you sort of focused on institutions rather than the personalities themselves. So I was thinking about sort of the conundrum that Mike Johnson perhaps finds himself in the coming weeks regarding, perhaps a government shutdown, et cetera. And so in understanding American legislatures, you do just that. It's about institutions and institutional features. So what are the ones, I'm so eloquent today. What are the institutional features that shape legislative outcomes most today that we don't notice as the public? And of course, the public really doesn't notice anything that Congress does unless they're, throwing chairs at each other. So, but I am curious about, since you were discussing process, what are those procedures?
Yeah, like what are the real drivers? I think at the end of the day, the things that really matter for what outputs we see in Congress are to some degree the really obvious things that we often look past now. It's the fact that it's these big macro level things, right? It's the fact that we have a bicameral Congress, which means you have these sort of overlapping representational districts in the House and the Senate that don't align, where you have to get essentially two separate legislatures to agree on a bill that raises this like very, very high bar to get something off the hill and sent to the president's desk, which means, that you need to have usually pretty wide support to get something done. It's the fact that we have a separation of power system where there's an executive branch and a legislative branch, and they both have policymaking power, which isn't true in all political systems, but is true in separation of power presidential systems. That big macro thing is really important. And I think the fact that we elect each member of Congress separately from their own geographically distinct districts is really important. I think these are big things that we learn about, like the Constitution when we're young, if we're lucky. And I think we often now, like, we look past these like static major things that I think really shape what happens in Congress and what can and can't be done. I think we often look past them because they aren't dynamic. They don't change. They haven't evolved. They don't make headlines.
They're not sexy.
Rampant.
Yeah.
They're not sexy. And so I think like more and more, I'm convinced that we need to be paying more attention to these like big static, boring things that we've known about forever that we've been paying less attention to, because I think they really become the drivers of what happens on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. The bicameral nature of this just complicated. And I try to tell my students, American government is complicated, and it was designed to be rather complicated. And the very fact that we have this bicameral system where you've got to get both chambers passing the exact same thing before it can move forward immediately slows down anything happening, right? But like you said, it also ensures that what gets passed has some level of pretty broad support. And is less of, I know we see a lot of bills that get passed on party lines and that kind of thing, and we can nitpick a little bit, but the reality is if you get it out of the House and the Senate, you've got some support, right? And so I think that's a good thing, but it does slow the process down. And I think in today's world, a lot of people just don't appreciate, to use a word used, the deliberative nature of the institution. They don't appreciate that there's a lot of negotiation. You got 535 people between these two chambers who all are representing varied interests and very diverse interests across the country. And you've got to try to bring these folks together to get something done. That's going to take a little bit of time.
That's right. I was talking about this with my students in class this week. it's first week of class. I'm teaching a class on the presidency, and I was like bringing up this very fact that Americans often get frustrated that their government moves so slow and that a lot of things don't happen. And I think what a lot of them don't appreciate is that our government's different from a lot of other governments, and that the legislature actually writes the laws, which is not unique, but is rare. Typically in a lot of governmental systems, especially parliamentary systems or systems that have very, very strong presidents, institutional presidents, the executive branch writes the policies, the executive writes the policies, the prime minister writes the policies with their cabinet, and the legislature just it's just a yes or a no.
Rubber stamp.
That's a lot quicker to get to an outcome, whether it's yes, we're going to pass this or no, or not. But in the United States, Congress writes the laws. The legislature writes the laws. In the states, the state legislatures write the laws, but for the most part.
For better or for worse.
That's harder. Well, it's for better or for worse, but it's a lot more difficult because now you have to get all these people to agree on this written text rather than writing it somewhere else and it's just voted on yes or no, right? So which does mean in the way that it's structured with 2 chambers, which is true in 49 of the 50 states too, means you're going to have to build broader support. And the parties themselves are relatively fractured because they're not elected collectively, they're elected independently and separately. And that means that very few things pass on a party line vote. Things pass one chamber or the other in a party line vote, but very few things pass both chambers on a party line vote. You tend to need to, even during unified party control, you tend to need to end up getting broader support in order to win at least a majority in both chambers, which means by the time you've done that, you get large, bipartisan, often supermajorities in both chambers. And that, yes, it has its costs and then it makes it harder to do things. You're going to have more stalemate. You're going to have less action sometimes when you want it, but you're also going to have fewer laws that pass that are hated by massive swaths of the American public. You're going to have fewer rapid back and forth changes in statute. You're going to have plenty of that with executive action, but at least we also don't have it with legislative action. And so there's a little bit more stability to our laws. Those things have their own virtues. And, there's just, you got to pick your poison.
You mentioned the state legislatures, and that's something that I think is near and dear to both Emily and I's hearts. We try to remind people, hey, there are these other legislative bodies that they have some pretty big impact too. But as you know, most of the focus in this country is on Congress. And I'm just wondering, what do we miss, right? What do we miss that is happening in state legislatures? What are some of the dynamics that we don't understand going on when all we're doing is looking at Congress?
And there's so much you miss, right? A lot of the policymaking happens at the state level. Obviously, the national government's power is supreme, but a lot of stuff is left to the states. And you all don't need to hear this from me, better than I do. But certain areas of policy really are mostly in the state's control, whether it's in to some degree more in the state's control than they were in the past after we've had some devolution over the last 30, 40 years. But education policy, you really have to pay attention to the states. Criminal justice policy, you have to pay attention to the states, most policing policy. But these things happen at the state and local level, which is really important. I also think studying state legislatures is really important for us, from a scholarly standpoint. You can learn quite a bit about how Congress works from studying the states. It's hard to study Congress because there's only one Congress, and its processes change only very slowly. In the states, you have a lot of variety of legislative rules and processes and norms and whatnot, right? Some of those mirror Congress's processes and rules and norms, and some of them don't. We can learn a lot about whether different processes, structures, or whatever seem to produce different outcomes or different legislative politics or not by looking at the states. And in my own experience, I try to do a bit of this in my research. And then what I find is sometimes, the differences across states or within states when they've changed things do matter, and sometimes they don't. And I think this helps us better understand when structures and rules and processes that we assumed were critical, we can find out whether they actually are or not. And, I've had, for example, I have a paper with Rob Oldham, who's a assistant professor at Scott Agnes College in Georgia, where we look at end of debate thresholds, things essentially what is essentially the equivalent of the filibuster, right? And, in the Senate, it's a 60 vote threshold to end debate. Like that's what we talk about is like the 60 vote Senate or the filibuster in the Senate. Well, in the states, that threshold varies quite a bit. You have some states and some legislatures where it's a strict majoritarian threshold. You have some where it's 3/5. Like in the Senate, you have some where it's higher, right? And so if you want to know whether how much those rules matter, you can't just look at the United States Senate because it's static, it's constant, it doesn't change. You don't really know, is it that or is it something else? Well, Rob and I find that it doesn't seem to matter at the state level. Like states that have higher end of debate thresholds in their legislatures are not more bipartisan. They are not less productive. There isn't more gridlock than states where they have lower thresholds, which suggests that maybe our concern about the filibuster is overblown. It doesn't prove it, but it certainly suggests it. Whereas on the other hand, I have another paper recently published with Andy Ballard at Florida State and Mary Krager at UNC, where we look at the different separation of powers dynamics across states and within states as they change. And we find that that does matter. States that have like stricter separation of powers dynamics that we should make it harder for legislation to happen, that should make more bipartisanship be the norm, do. And so like you can look to the states to try to find out like which of these things seem to actually be important and which don't, at least to the best of our knowledge. And like I find that really revealing then when I have to go back and think about the Congress and what actually matters there.
Yeah.
It goes back to the old laboratories of democracy concept, right? And by having the larger number, we can observe these observations and or these differences in processes, and like you said, figure out what does work and what doesn't.
I'm curious, did you guys look at issues of germaneness or over legislators?
That's where so this is where I'm turning now. I'm working with some grad students here at Notre Dame where now I want to collect, and I've gotten myself into probably a project that's maybe going to be too hard to actually execute. We want to collect data on like all the rules in every state legislature that should be relevant to these types of things, right? And that alone is going to be quite an undertaking. But one of these would be like germaneness rules. Like, does that make a difference? Or all sorts of quorum requirements or requirements. What's the sufficient second, as they call it, to demand a vote? Like these things vary all over the place, and we don't know enough about. Yeah, well, we don't know enough about which of them do and don't matter, and in what ways, right? And so this will be quite an undertaking. These grad students are brave for taking this on with me because it's going to be a lot of work. But we'll find out someday when we're done.
It's very interesting. Whenever I was a reporter at the Oklahoma State Capitol, it always was very interesting to me that the House had germaneness, right, rules, and the Senate did not. And so you could, gut an entire Senate bill and dump language in it. And we have seen, and again, when you have a supermajority of Republicans, and even at that time, it wasn't a supermajority, but it was a majority of Republicans whenever I was there. And I mean, the workers' comp bill was a really good example back when Benj and Coffee almost came to blows in the middle of the rotunda. We had a pro tem and a Speaker of the House, both Republicans, trying to get different versions of this workers' comp bill reconciled, and due to issues of germaneness, it was just a mess. They dumped it into a Senate bill at the very last minute of we were in the 7-hour final throes of being required by law to sine die, and it was just a complete mess. So I was just always salivated over issues of germaneness. So anyway, I'm very much a nerd, if you cannot tell, James Curry.
There's so many things, of course, in Oklahoma, like about 15 or 16 other states, we've got term limits, which impacts things. The length of the legislative session can matter.
How often it meets.
Right, how often they meet, all of this type of thing.
There's so much that it varies from state to state. And again, so you can really learn which of these things seem to there's an opportunity here to really drill down on which of these things matter and how do they matter in a way that you can't by just looking at one legislature at a time.
Well, if you guys need an end to our incestuous, crazy Oklahoma legislature, let us know. We'd be happy
to certainly take you up on it.
Please. I just think there's, like we were talking about before we started recording, Oklahoma is just, we get overlooked as this, just wholly conservative, bloody red state at this point. And the flavors of conservatism and the infighting that occurs within our supermajority, and even our talking about the separation of powers. The Oklahoma Constitution, socialist, populist, right? We completely we elect our light
don't let anybody make any decisions.
Our treasurer, it's crazy. This system, and so I would be really interested to see what conclusions you would come to regarding our state's legislator.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, I'll be interested too when we get there.
Please, man, come on, I'm ready. And by the way, you owe me. I need funding, Alan. I got an email about him booking flights this morning. I need some money. SSN. Make it rain.
I hope I have an answer for you next week. That's my goal.
I love you. No worries, man. Either way, I'm going to obviously buy him a plane ticket and we'll figure it out later. Clearly I'm going to figure it out, man. We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu. Just to wrap up the interview, I want to bring in modern politics and what's going on in Washington, D.C. now. So how do our recent legislative crises, particularly the number of shutdowns that we've seen in the 21st century, just in the last decade, debate ceiling, brinksmanship, talking about the filibuster and that the arguments there, et cetera. How do these legislative crises reinforce or challenge the arguments that you've made?
I think what they do, and I guess we can talk about how this relates to anything I've said before, but I think what crises do is they help Congress get to an outcome, right? An old staffer in Washington used to try to constantly describe members of Congress to me as sort of like students who like to put things off to the last second, procrastinators. And so they need, because it's such a, as we talked about, it's such a long, difficult process to come to agreement. And there's always more agreement you can come to, and there's always tweaks you can make. And if there isn't a deadline, action may never happen. So I think one thing that for all the downsides of shutdown, fights and debt ceiling brinksmanship and all these things, to some degree, these crises are helpful because they create deadlines. Right. If the government's going to shut down, you got to do it. Right. And now that deadline and that having to have a bill that moves, that funds the government, creates an opportunity for other things to pass too. They hitch a ride in these appropriations bills, or they hitch a ride in the defense authorization. I'm really interested to see what ends up in these packages of appropriations bills before they get to the president's desk, because it's always where members will negotiate to get this other thing that's been moving through Congress that just can't quite get over the finish line. Can we attach it here? Because maybe nobody is upset about it enough to sink it over this, but maybe it would be grueling to get it through the floor on its own. Or here's, the opportunity is here now. We're all interested in acting now, so let's act. And so in a way, they help overcome a lot of that. And that's really where party leaders also play a major role, because they're the ones managing that end stage process. They're the ones making the final decision about what is in and what is out on these large bills that move before a deadline. They seem so critical, even if they're also damaging, and especially damaging to Congress's public relations, because it doesn't make them look good that they only do things at the last second. But to some degree, I can relate to it. I think we all do better when we have a deadline that forces us to act. So. To some degree, it is what it is. It doesn't look good, but I think that they help, in the long run, they help Congress get to some sort of outcome.
There's an old saying I've heard that says that tight deadlines focus the mind. And maybe there's a little bit of that going on, there. this has been really nice to talk to someone who isn't just like, oh, Congress, they're horrible. Yeah. They don't know.
No, you've been super optimistic.
Is a little encouraging on this point. I don't know if I'm fully there, but it's nice to have someone who's like, for what they have to do, they do an okay job. Right. They're not great. It's not the best in the world, but it could be a lot worse.
They earned that 27% today approval rating.
I think it could be a lot worse. I think that is true.
It's been a lot worse. It has been a lot worse in our lifetime, in this century.
But really appreciate you coming on and visiting with us. This has been fascinating. I have 3 more books I need to put on my reading list to go and investigate. They sound fascinating on their own. They're probably as a collection, they're pretty impressive as well. So thank you for spending some time with us this morning.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here. This was so much fun. You guys are great to talk to.
Yay, fabulous. I thought whenever we first had our Zoom meeting and I just kind of let it all hang out and he was very good-natured about it, that James Curry could probably hang just a little bit, like that he could probably hang. He would be down. So I'm very glad that you were brave enough to come on the podcast, and we will certainly have you back again. And
absolutely.
If you would like to come.
That would be wonderful.
Absolutely. We want to thank all of our listeners, and we will be back again soon. There's too much going on, not for us to.
We need to have a rant show.
We might need to have a rant show. That's for sure. And we want to remind everyone that
democracy is not a spectator sport.
Thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, this is Deborah, the resident Gen Z member of the Not My Generation podcast family. Not My Generation is produced in the Possibilities Inc. studio. This episode was produced by Santiago Ramones. It was edited by Santiago Ramones. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Send a voice memo to notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu and you could hear your voice on an upcoming episode. If you liked today's episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and sharing the podcast with others. You can check out previous episodes on any podcast app and on our podcast website at notmygeneration.captivate.fm, where we also provide our show notes. And remember, you can follow Not My Generation on X, formerly known as Twitter, at NMG Podcast, and on Facebook at Not My Generation Podcast. We look forward to interacting with you soon.